Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today I would like to begin with where I had ended in the last lecture. You would recall I had emphasized towards the end the discussion on basically three ideas, and these ideas are phenomenal consciousness, experiential subjectivity, and the first-person point of view, the first-person perspective of consciousness as such. These three concepts are intricately and inextricably tied up with one another, and at the same time, it is in an unpacking of this complex network of three ideas that we get an idea of what the subject of experience is, or what the self is, what the I is. So far, my discussion has not been much too phenomenologically oriented, because the discussion has been prominently with regard to the various theories of mind, and the last two theories where the discussion had gained momentum were theories that are methodologically more objectively oriented because of their scientific standpoint. And objective scientific methodological standpoint can be described as sharply contrasted with the phenomenological standpoint, which is more first-person perspective oriented. Of course, towards the end, in the last discussion, there was sufficient exploration into the whole matter of phenomenal consciousness, experiential subjectivity, and also the first-person perspective that's integral to both these concepts, or integral to phenomenal consciousness as such. So today in this lecture, I take the opportunity to go into the phenomenological direction with a certain amount of urgency and also importance. You would recall that I stressed upon the necessity of the first-person perspective when it came to capturing the intrinsic qualitative essence of various phenomenal states of consciousness. By intrinsic qualitative essence, I mean the sort of specific feel that, in a way, defines the very essence of those phenomenal mental states, like pain or perceptual experience. And of course, the basic criticism of the objectively oriented theories like functionalism was that in their enthusiasm for capturing the functional dimension of mental states, including phenomenal mental states, they overlooked that apart from function, such states also have a feel. So function and feel together constitute the overall conception of those mental states like pain or perceptual experience. While theories like functionalism excelled in explaining the functional dimension, they were completely incapable of capturing the feeling dimension. In fact, by nature, the feeling dimension would be left out in such a theoretical approach, precisely because, as I did say more than once, such theories are, or particularly functionalism, defines mental states in relational terms, in terms of causal functional relation, and not in terms of whether the mental state might also have an intrinsic non-relational inner qualitative essence. That's where the importance and the urgency of the phenomenological approach, the approach to such mental concepts, phenomenal mental concepts from the first-person perspective needs to be reiterated. And that's why my intention in this lecture is to go rather deeply into it, and also in a detailed way as much as possible. How does a phenomenal consciousness or experiential mental states, how do such mental states with phenomenal properties relate to the first-person perspective in an intimate way? Well, that's because, as we discussed in the last lecture with reference to that famous notion of what it is like of a mental state proposed by Thomas Nagel, namely the idea that if I am in a conscious experiential state, then my being in that state is a matter of there being something which it is like for me to be in that state. That means there is a what it is like property which is salient to the given mental state that I find myself in, like a state of pain or a perceptual state of tasting a lemon or seeing something green. So obviously it would be an appropriate question to ask what it is like for me to experience something green or taste something like a lemon when I do have any such experience. So the what it is like property picks out the inner feel of the experiential state, that inner feel which makes the state what it is, even though that very state might satisfy a specific functional role, even though that inner state with that feel performs a particular causal functional role in relation to environmental input, other inner states, and behavioral output. So the what it is likeness of these states, or for that matter any state of conscious experience, inevitably links it to the first-person perspective. And that point was discussed in the earlier lecture, in the sense that, of course, when I'm experiencing the taste of lemon, the sour taste of lemon, what it is like for me to experience that taste of lemon already signifies that that experiential feel is a feel for me. So the subject, the first person, is very much implicit, or rather explicit, in the very articulation of such an experience in terms of the what it is like property. So Nagel's elucidation of the what it is likeness of conscious experiential states is at the same time an elucidation of the first person perspective, because it is only from the perspective of the subject of that experience, from the first person subjective perspective of the experiencer, that there is something which it is like to be in that experiential state. There is something which it is like for the subject to experience the sourness of a lemon, or the sweetness of sugar, or the greeniness of a leaf in a visual experience. So that's the connection between phenomenal consciousness, or states of phenomenal consciousness, like various sensory experiences, and the first person perspective. And what makes the given experience subjective is precisely that the experience occurs from the first person perspective, from the perspective of the subject. So that often used expression of the subjectivity of mental states, particularly experiential mental states, that notion of subjectivity should not be delinked, or should not be interpreted by delinking it from the subject of the experience. On the contrary, the subjectivity of the state is directly derived from its being a state, the mental reality of which is totally from the first person perspective, or perspective of the subject. So that's the original foundational articulation of the meaning of subjectivity of phenomenal or conscious experiential mental states. It is in this connection that we can proceed to talk quite relevantly, to talk about the idea of consciousness, which is consciousness of conscious experience. So the idea of consciousness as it occurs in conscious experience, and the idea of the subject or self who has the conscious experience. So the subject of experience, or the subject of conscious experiential states, is also the self, or what we call the self. And in that sense, if the subject is aware of the what it is like property of a given experience, if, for example, I'm aware of what it is like for me to experience a lemon, then, of course, the I here, the subject, the self, is very much implicit as that as that whatever, that entity, that subject, which is aware of the inner feel of the state, what it is like property. That means I am aware of my awareness, and that makes it self-awareness. So if I am in a state of awareness, which is awareness of an experiential state, the taste of a lemon, say the sourness of a lemon, then of course I'm aware of that very awareness. I'm self-aware. In other words, every such awareness of what it is likeness of a given experience is at once self-awareness. Now, this notion of self-consciousness or self-awareness is rather it could be misleading, because in the philosophical literature, especially in contemporary times, there have been controversies or theories about self-consciousness or self-awareness that differ radically from one another. Now, there's one view according to which, and probably a view which is a very tempting one, which is that if I'm aware of being aware of the taste of the lemon, then there must be awareness at two levels. There is a fragmentation of awareness here. There is a kind of self-division of the stream of consciousness in which this experiential awareness occurs. That is to say, there is a first level or primary level awareness of the taste of the lemon, and then there is a second order or second level or secondary or higher level awareness of this lower level primary awareness of the taste of the lemon. And that's the way self-awareness would be analyzed in terms of some kind of a hierarchical ordering, at least at two levels: the primary level of basic awareness, and then the higher level or second order awareness of the first order primary awareness. Now, the controversy with that sort of interpretation, that sort of theory of self-consciousness or self-awareness is regarding whether this level distinction or fragmentation of levels is right or it is wrong. The alternative view is that there is no fragmentation of levels. It is at one and the same level that self-awareness occurs. And the point of this alternative view, criticizing the view of higher order analysis of self-awareness, is this: that if you resort to the higher order analysis of self-awareness, saying that there is this primary first order awareness that becomes the object of awareness from a second order perspective, then obviously this involves the objectification or objectivation of the first order primary level or primary awareness, awareness of the taste of the lemon or what it is likeness of the lemon. And this sort of objectification from a higher order standpoint would entail a kind of reflective stance deliberately adopted by the mind or by the subject, so that from that higher order standpoint it adopts a reflective gaze. It has a kind of reflective gaze at the given first order primary experiential content. The big question is, the crucial question is whether any reflection occurs in my awareness of the what it is likeness of a given experiential or conscious state. The alternative view disclaims the occurrence of any reflective stance. It disclaims because if one were to concede the reflective interpretation of self-awareness, then that concession would entail that at the primary level, at the first order level, the given or primary experience wasn't in itself a self-conscious experience. Rather, a reflective gaze has lent to it the character of a conscious awareness. In other words, until I adopt the reflective gaze or the reflective stance towards the given experience, then although I had the what it is likeness experience of feel of the state, I was having that or experiencing that feel in a rather unconscious way. That's what it would mean, because conscious awareness, to describe that state in terms of conscious awareness, would mean that some sort of extra work, reflective work, had to be done upon it so as to render it into a state of conscious awareness. And that sounds pretty counterintuitive, because, I mean, one can find that out almost introspectively by just attending to the experience from the first person point of view, introspectively, which is that if I am tasting a lemon, the lemon is sour. Of course, I am in a state of conscious awareness. I'm consciously aware of the sourness of the lemon or what it is like to taste that lemon. So that conscious awareness is built into the given first order experiential state. It's not something that is in any way added to it. The character of its being a state of conscious awareness is not an addition to that primary experience from some extra higher order reflective standpoint. So the alternative theory insists against the higher order theory that fragments the stream of consciousness by saying that it is this sort of self-awareness of phenomenal states, experiential states, is a pre-reflective self-awareness. it is not self-awareness that is a product of a reflective act of consciousness where the success of the attempt is the success of self-identification through such a higher order reflective act. Nothing like that is true of self-awareness in the case of phenomenal states with what it is like property. So this pre-reflective notion of self-awareness is a contestant in regard to the reflective higher order analysis or theory of self-awareness. As far as I am concerned, I subscribe to the pre-reflective self-consciousness theory precisely because it is consistent with the way we have analyzed phenomenal mental states by reference to the first-person perspective and the what it is likeness that is intrinsic to such mental states. And the reason why I am in support of this view is that it allows me, or rather whoever is in support of this pre-reflective view of self-awareness would be allowed to see another significant point, to infer another significant point, which is about the very idea of the self as a subject of experience. And this idea of a self as a subject of experience is a critical idea in the sense that it very readily admits of very different sort of analysis and interpretation. And some of these analysis and interpretation would go quite contrary to the way the first-person analysis of phenomenal states in terms of their what it is like properties has been provided so far. So I shall go into that difference in course of my discussion, but of course my emphasis is on, it's going to be laid on a particular view of what the self is that one can draw from the notion of a subject of experience of such phenomenal states. And whatever I'm going to say now is, as I had already indicated a little while ago, is more in the category of the phenomenological tradition of philosophy. The phenomenological approach, as it is traditionally advocated by thinkers like Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, and Jean-Paul Sartre. And more importantly, a very eminent thinker in that tradition, but a thinker who internalizes the methodological principles of Anglo-American analytic philosophy, so that the sort of analysis of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, and the notion of the subject of experience of such phenomenally conscious states. The sort of analysis and interpretation that this contemporary philosopher provides is, in a way, understandable from both the continental European standpoint and also the Anglo-American analytic standpoint. So his name is Dan Zahavi, a Danish philosopher who has probably done the maximum in trying to articulate these intricate ideas of the phenomenological tradition on the analysis and interpretation of consciousness, especially phenomenal consciousness, in relation to the self or the subject of experience. So what in the phenomenological tradition, what is said about self-consciousness is precisely the thesis that such phenomenal states are self-conscious or self-aware states, and that is pre-reflective self-awareness. In other words, if we take any ordinary example of experience or consciousness of the world, and an ordinary example would be one of intentional consciousness, that is to say, being in a state like perceiving or believing, where the state has the intentional property of being world-directed. I mean, perception, for instance, is perception of something in the world, an object in the world. So intentional mental states are object-directed. It is mapped onto something like a mind-world directionality. So if I have any such ordinary perceptual experience, an experience of, let's say, a red flower in front of me, then by that very fact, I'm aware of having the experience of the what it is likeness of the red flower. So this self-awareness is built into my perceptual object awareness. And this built-in character is described as pre-reflective self-awareness. This is true of Husserl, true of Heidegger, and very true of Sartre, although they put this very point in different ways. And Zahavi has taken the entire tradition to summarize the entire tradition, the view of the entire tradition on this idea of pre-reflective self-awareness, and has explored this very point, has advanced, has elaborated and augmented this very point, interpretative point, by bringing in a new idea. And the idea is this: if I have any experience, if there is any experience in the flow of consciousness that I undergo, one could say I am presented with a certain experience. So this presentation, this metaphor of presentation of an experience, can also be redescribed as a certain experience is given. A certain experience is given in my field of consciousness. What is presented in my field of consciousness. And if it is given there in that field, it automatically follows that it is given to me. It is presented to me. And one could say from this, without much distortion, that there is a self-presentational quality to that experience. There is this feature of self-givenness of the experience in question. Indeed, there is no other mode of givenness in which the experience would occur. It would occur in this self-presentational or self-given mode. Why? Well, that is because of the very nature of consciousness. And this is not a profound point. Nonetheless, it is a highly significant point, conceptually very important point, that we understand, we come to see clearly, transparently, that experiences have a self-presentational quality, built-in self-presentational quality or givenness. So Zahavi is saying, on the basis of this phenomenologically detectable feature of experience, Zahavi is saying that since an experience is given in the way of being given for me, for the subject, just as Nagel's "What It Is Like" property is explained by saying that there is something that it is like for the subject, for me, to be in a state of tasting a sour lemon, or in a state of seeing the greenness of leaves, or hearing the melody of a song. So there is this for the subject or for me-ness feature which is built into experiential episodes. And that's the notion of a subject of experience, that me or that I, who is the subject. So for me-ness, from this for me-ness quality, phenomenologically discerned for me-ness quality, Zahavi is deriving the idea of a self. And of course, it's a very thin self. It's obviously a very thin self because the constitution of the self is utterly minimal, and therefore one could also call it a minimal self. This minimalism is, I hope, obvious from this discussion because it is a self only because what the subject experiences is already an experience that has the phenomenological structure of being given to me, being presented to me, that phenomenological structure of self-presentation. And there is nothing more to the content of this self, to the constitution of this self, than that. So it must clearly be a self in a very minimal sense, and therefore a minimal or thin self. Probably it couldn't get thinner than that. There is no thickness to this self. So Zahavi is formulating a theory of the self in terms of this minimal self in the phenomenological tradition. And this minimal self, thin self, is implicit, very much implicit, in that tradition of phenomenologists from which tradition Zahavi draws in developing his own contemporary phenomenological theory of self through an analysis of phenomenal consciousness or experiential mental states. It is at this juncture that I should not forget to connect the idea of this minimal self to the other idea that has already been dominant as an explanatory concept in our discussion, and that is the idea of the first-person perspective. So you might wonder at this stage, what's the relation, if any, between this minimal self, the thin self that is derived from the self-presentational phenomenological quality of experience. What is the relation of this idea of the minimal self with that of the first-person perspective? The connection should be quite obvious because it is so very intimate. It's almost like a connection of identity, a relation of identity. In other words, when I'm talking about the forminess quality, the self-presentational quality, the self-givenness of an experience, I'm talking about a mode of experience which characterizes the very nature of consciousness. That means consciousness has a built-in mode, and that is the first-person mode. So the first-person perspective is a kind of modality, concept of modality. It is in that mode that experiences are, as it were, presented in the field of in the field of consciousness. That means there is no other mode than the first-person mode in which conscious states can occur. So the occurrence of conscious states is structurally determined by the first-person perspective. I mean, it would be completely absurd to say that some experience is given to me from the third-person perspective, because consciousness is by nature defined by the first-person perspective, and therefore such experiential phenomenal conscious states necessarily, structurally, would be presented or given in that perspective, in no other than that perspective. And therefore, this for-me-ness or self-givenness is just a direct result of the structural property of consciousness, which is its first-person perspective. And this is a purely perspectival analysis of the subject of consciousness or the self. I mean, the notion of the minimal self is fully drawn from the idea of the first-person perspective. So that's the only content, if one were to really talk about the content of the minimal self or the constitution of the minimal self, then that's the only thing one could cite, namely the first-person perspective. As a matter of fact, one couldn't even say that the minimal self has any content whatsoever. If by content, by mental content, we mean something like intentional content, say the content of a thought, the content of a belief, or even a phenomenal content, like the content of a pain or the content of a perceptual experience. No such content really constitutes the self, the minimal self, because if it is entirely constituted by the first-person perspective, then it is obvious why there would be no substantive content in it, because a perspective is not a content. A perspective is a mode in which other contentful mental states are delivered. So the mode itself is not a content. The mode facilitates the delivery of content. And I think this is a very important point to understand, to remember in our new understanding of what the self is, the self defined as a minimal self, or characterized as a minimal self, as a thin self. We will not understand the very notion of a minimal self without any reference to the first-person perspective and how the relation between the first-person perspective and the minimal self is to be understood. And something more about the first-person perspective should be added here, I suppose, and that is because if one were to say consciousness has the first-person perspective structurally built into it, then the attribution of a self to any conscious entity might look like an inevitable consequence. I mean, if any consciousness is structurally first-personal, determined by the first-person perspective, then it would follow that to be a conscious being is to have that first-person perspective. And then if the notion of the self or minimal self is defined purely perspectively, that is to say purely in terms of that first-person perspective through which any experience is delivered or presented to the subject, then it would also mean that any such conscious being would also be a self, at least a minimal self. Now, on that point, there is some difference of opinion, and that difference of opinion may be important for us to, it may be important for us to know what that difference is. Here, I would like to mention two thinkers, and both these thinkers, contemporary philosophers, are not from the phenomenological tradition. They rather are from the Anglo-American tradition. one British, another American. One is Lynn Rudder Baker, a very well-known American philosopher. Baker draws a distinction between two types of first-person perspective. One she calls the strong first-person perspective, and the other one the weak first-person perspective. And this distinction between the weak version and the strong version of the first-person perspective is drawn by her in order for her to be able to say where amongst conscious beings the self is available, and where, even though the being is a conscious being, the self is not available, despite the fact that the first-person perspective is structurally true of that conscious being. Because for any conscious being or for any consciousness, the first-person perspective is a structural property. So, for example, let's say a bird. A bird is also conscious, and you and I are also conscious. So, two species of conscious beings. We would very easily attribute a self to beings, conscious beings like you and me, a human conscious being. Because that's where the notion of the self finds its paradigmatic application. So even if it is the minimal self, without any problem, we would attribute a self to the human conscious being. And of course, to attribute a self to a conscious being is to attribute it because of the presence of the first-person perspective that characterizes the conscious being. Now the question is, the bird is also a conscious being, and the bird also, in virtue of its consciousness, is characterized by the first-person perspective. In other words, the bird has the first-person perspective as much as a human individual has the first-person perspective. There is complete parity at that level in the presence of the first-person perspective. But one might hesitate to ascribe a self to the bird in the way one does not hesitate at all to ascribe a self to the human conscious organism or conscious being. Now, why talk about a bird? One might even hesitate to ascribe a self, including a minimal self, to a very young baby, which is a human baby, and a conscious human baby individual at that. So why could this hesitation occur? Why might such a hesitation occur? That despite recognizing the presence of the first-person perspective in that conscious system, you are, or you might be reluctant to add that this conscious entity with its first-person perspective qualifies to be an entity with a self, even a minimal self. Why? For what reason? Now, the answer to this question, a very important question, given by Baker and by another person, another philosopher, the British philosopher, Qasim Qassam, an Oxford philosopher. Qassam also says, very much like Baker, that you can be self-conscious, or you can have consciousness of self. You can be self-conscious only if you have a fairly explicit consciousness of a self. That is to say, you have to be conscious of your own identity. I mean, whatever that being is, would have to be conscious of its own identity as a subject of experience, as a bearer of different experiences. So that's a very bold claim about self-consciousness. And it's quite clear that the bird is a conscious entity, a conscious individual, but it's very doubtful that one would think that not only that the bird is a conscious entity, I mean, because it is conscious of what goes on in its surrounding, but it is also conscious of being such a conscious entity, such a self with its own identity, conscious of being the subject of bearers of different experiences. That you would hesitate to attribute. So it is already clear that there is a very strong view of self-consciousness in Kassam, and this strong view of self-consciousness is in consonance with Lynn Baker's idea of a strong first-person perspective. In other words, before I conclude this lecture, I would just add this point for elaborating it in the subsequent one, which is that the strong first-person perspective has something more in it that is lacking in conscious creatures, which are described as endowed with a weak first-person perspective. What that difference is, I shall initiate a discussion on that when I commence the next lecture. Thank you.